All right, welcome to Unit 1 for your United States history class. We're going to start off with the United States entering a new era following the end of the American Civil War. So remember, the American Civil War was fought from 1861 to 1865 and resulted in the deaths of over 700,000 Americans and the destruction of the southern states and the southern economy, and also the liberation of millions of slaves who became American citizens with the passing of the 14th and 15th Amendments. And we're going to be talking today, and let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to go to our Nearpod here and go to the preview. So you have access to this Nearpod in your first lesson. And we're going to be spending some time talking about the industrialization of the United States after the American Civil War. Now, we will talk a little bit about the Civil War, but that's actually not considered part of this high school course. Of course, if you're interested in the American Civil War, I can point you to many great resources. And we're actually not really going to be talking all that much about Reconstruction, because that was also in your middle school class. We're going to spend a lot of time in this lesson talking about something called Westward expansion. So we're going to look at how the West was transformed. So to understand the growth of the United States, we have to rewind all the way back to, the settlement of the eastern seaboard of of North America in the 1600s. So you recall, the first colonies, and then the original 13 colonies, and then those colonies fought for their independence from the British Empire, and they won, and the United States was formed. And from that point on, Americans had been pushing westward across the continent in search of resources and land. So by the 1860s, the federal government is speeding this process up by passing something called the Homestead Act and allowing for and subsidizing the construction of something called the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, all of these, this westward expansion, just like when the first colonists arrived in North America, was that North America was already occupied by Native Americans. And so the history of the first, 350 years of colonization of North America is about the interaction between colonists and the Native Americans who were living here. So we're going to look at some federal policies towards American Indians. And then lastly, we'll talk a lot about how after the American Civil War, what did the United States do to try to rebuild the country? And we're going to look at, that's called Reconstruction. And then we're going to look at something called the Compromise of 1877, which ended Reconstruction in the United States. So let's look at our big concepts. We're going to talk about Americans pushing west, and this is also tied into immigration. Immigration is going to be a big theme for the first third of this class. We'll look at Native Americans fighting and losing to keep their lands. We'll talk about how a lot of westward expansion originally was to expand slavery, which of course ended with the American Civil War. And this was one of the reasons why the American Civil War was fought over. Should these Western territories be free or slave? I mentioned that the North wins the Civil War led by Abraham Lincoln, and there's a big decision on how to rebuild the South, and this is called Reconstruction. And there's going to be millions of slaves who become American citizens. So a large portion of our course talks about the issues African Americans face in the United States following the American Civil War. And we're going to look at the two political parties that controlled Congress, the Republicans and the Democrats, and what do the Republicans want to do to help the freedmen or the freed slaves, and what do the Democrats not want to do to help them? And then we'll look at, this lesson ends with Reconstruction ending in 1877. So we're essentially kind of talking about, well, 1865 to 1877, although the Transcontinental Railroad and the Homestead Act occurred while the Civil War is occurring. So let's look at the growth of the United States. So we have over on the far eastern side of our map in the green, the original 13 colonies. And ever since the original 13 colonies, the United States has sought to expand across the continent. This is called manifest destiny, the belief that it's the destiny of the United States to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Of course, we had that large Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon by Thomas Jefferson, and the lands that we took or won from Mexico in the Mexico-American War, and also purchasing the Oregon country from Great Britain. And then the American Civil War. So the South, the Confederate States fighting to keep their livelihood in slaves, and the North led by the newly created Republican Party led by Abraham Lincoln, which sought to end the expansion of slavery in the United States. And the way to end the expansion of slavery in the United States was to end slavery. That's what Lincoln ultimately decided as the Civil War raged on and hundreds of thousands of Americans were being killed. He felt that the war had to have a moral point, and the moral point of the war would be to end this slavery in the United States. And you'll notice on this map here that most of the war is fought by the South because the North, the federal government, the Union, had to force the Confederacy to essentially not exist. So all of the major conflicts and fighting are in the South, of course, except for Gettysburg and Antietam. There's also fighting in Kentucky and Missouri, but most of the major battles are fought in the South as the Northern armies have to push in and occupy these Confederate states. And of course, ultimately, you should know this story is the South loses. The South has to be occupied by the Union so it can be rebuilt. And slavery is ended. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. All right, let's look at, you have to know some essential vocabulary, and essentially how each unit works is there's going to be some essential vocab for you to know, key terms, and I'm going to take you through those. So of course, the first one is the Homestead Act. So the United States government wanted to get Americans out west. Well, they had to be encouraged because it was difficult living out west on the prairies. You're under constant threat of attacks by Native American tribes who are upset about the incursion of American citizens. Weather's harsh, it's difficult, it's flat, there's all sorts of different environmental problems that face these settlers. So they're encouraged to go out and settle these public lands. And if they live on these public lands and settle them, then they're given a certain amount of acres. And this is called the Homestead Act. And this spurs even more immigration into the United States. So as Europeans, poor Europeans who are living in a continent that's already been settled and all the land has already been taken, they hear about the federal government of the United States essentially giving away farmland. So this brings a lot of immigrants in from Europe. And then we have the Transcontinental Railroad, probably one of my favorite pieces of American history. It's a continuous rail line that would connect the eastern United States with the western United States. So it connects Omaha, Nebraska to the wharfs of San Francisco and California. So it's 1,900 miles of continuous rail line. And up to this point, we're going to talk about a lot of engineering achievements. This is going to be, up to this point, the great engineering achievement of the United States. And it's built by immigrants. So a lot of this country is built by slaves, former slaves, and immigrants. And of course, every American, unless you're a Native American, is an immigrant to this country at some point. And it's also built by the hundreds of thousands of Civil War veterans. So when the war ends, the railroad's not done, and these veterans are looking for work, and they also contribute to the construction of this this railroad. But it's also really important for you to remember the Chinese immigrants, because we're going to come back and talk about the issues that Chinese immigrants faced in the western part of the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries. So here's some fantastic photographs. I have a huge collection of these photographs captured. There was a photographer who was hired to document the construction of this rail line, and I wanted you to see all the pictures of the challenges that these construction companies faced. Tremendous challenges. I mean, mountain ranges. They had to go through the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada mountain ranges, deserts, and they were under constant threat of weather, climate. It's just a really monumental task to construct this railroad that's going to transform the United States. Railroads are what transform the country in terms of transportation. And I really love this picture. This photograph was taken at Promontory Point. So this is when the two rail companies finally met. So one rail company started in California and one started out in Nebraska, and they finally met in Utah, 1869. And if you look really closely at this picture, you will see, this is one of the few pictures that I could find where you can see the various ethnic groups who helped build this rail line. You can see the Chinese laborers who helped construct this incredible achievement, this transcontinental railroad, also called the Overland Route. All right, now, so Americans are moving west, we're building railroads out west. What's going to happen to the Native American groups that are settled out in these regions? And this is, of course, a really dark chapter, or dark part of the history of the United States. Is they're going to fight against the federal armies, and they're going to lose, and they're going to be forced onto reservations. And so the purpose of these reservations is to assimilate these Native American groups into American culture. So trying to take away their tribal identities and give them more of an American identity. And we have a reading that we're going to be doing for this lesson on some of the endings of this reservations and this assimilation. We'll talk about Wounded Knee, a terrible massacre of a lot of a group of Native Americans who didn't want to be on their reservation anymore. Okay, and then there was the Dawes Act. So this was passed to provide Native Americans land on the reservations. So the purpose was to turn Native Americans into farmers and destroy their tribal identity, their tribal system. And the West, of course, a lot of these tribes did not want to be on reservations, and they wanted to live the lives that they had prior to the colonization of the continent by Europeans. And of course, the Americans who went west destroyed a lot of their food supply. So this is a photograph of the bison who were almost eradicated out on the Great Plains. It was a primary food source for a lot of Plains Native Americans. So this is kind of a really sad chapter in American history. All right, and we're going to look at our final topic here for this lesson is something called the Compromise of 1877. So I'm going to explain to you real quick what Reconstruction was, because if you don't understand Reconstruction, you're not going to understand the Compromise of 1877. So following the end of the Civil War, of course, in 1865, Abraham Lincoln's killed, the leader of the Republican Party, who was going to rebuild the South, and he's going to be replaced by someone who's not going to be all that favorable, who's actually going to get impeached, Johnson, who was actually from Tennessee. And what we have during Reconstruction is we have a group of Republicans, and remember, Republicans were the ones who wanted to end slavery. And there's a group of Republicans called the Radical Republicans, and they want to punish the South. And most Southerners during this time period were Democrats. They're part of the Democratic Party. And so the Radical Republicans tried to force Reconstruction on the South. And they passed the 14th and 15th Amendments, and those guaranteed the rights to all Americans. And Southerners, white Southerners, didn't want to give African Americans who are now American citizens, they didn't want them to have the same rights as them. And they were bitter about losing the Civil War. And there was a lot of entrenched racism in the South from hundreds of years of slavery. And so what the United States has to do, what the radical Republicans have to do, is they have to put the federal army, the United States Army has to occupy the South to make sure that African Americans in the South are treated fairly, and to make sure that the elections in the South are fair. And so this occurs throughout. The president following Andrew Johnson is going to be the Civil War hero, Ulysses S. Grant. And so Ulysses S. Grant supports Reconstruction. Of course, he was a Union soldier, and his parents were anti-slavery advocates. They didn't like slavery. Grant didn't care for slavery. And so he's going to enforce Reconstruction on the South. And so all the southern states do is they try to find any way they can around Reconstruction. And this is when we have the formation of groups like the Ku Klux Klan and other extremist groups who want to terrorize Republicans, and they want to terrorize African Americans. And during this time period, most African Americans were Republicans, because the Republicans were the anti-slavery group and they were the pro-freedmen group. And of course, this benefited Republicans because first, they didn't want slavery, and second, they wanted the freedmen to vote Republican. So at the best point of Reconstruction, we have a lot of African Americans winning elections and taking local positions in government, taking state positions in government, and in the rare instances, taking positions in the federal government in Congress. Well, what happens in 1876 is there's a really big election. Ulysses S. Grant has served 2 terms and he's done. And so there's a big election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. And the election's incredibly close and bitter, and there's a lot of contested results across the country. And the Democrats claim that the Republicans are cheating, and the Republicans claim that the Democrats are blocking ballots in the South. And there can't be, they can't come to a decision on who wins the election. And what happens is Congress gets together in a meeting and Congress decides that the Republican, Hayes, will become president. And the Democrats, since they don't get the presidency, they get Reconstruction to end. So all the federal troops will leave the South. And all the troops will leave the African-American citizens in the South unprotected. And so that's the end of Reconstruction. So it was a very bitter dispute. A lot of the South was promising to leave again if they felt like the election wasn't fair. So we have Tilden or blood. So there was threats of another insurrection in the United States. And here's Rutherford B. Hayes, who's going to end up winning. So he was a Civil War hero for the North. And so what's going to happen is Reconstruction is going to end, and we're going to get segregation in the United States. So the United States will be segregated following Reconstruction until 1955. The United States will be segregated. And of course, that's 1955 is Brown versus Board of Education. And then once we get into the 1960s, we'll get the Civil Rights Acts, which will end segregation permanently in the United States. But we have a Supreme Court case that essentially allows for states to pass laws that segregate society. That's the famous saying where the Supreme Court says separate but equal. Society can be separate as long as it's equal. And I could go into a long talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, but essentially the South doesn't hear the equal part. They hear separate, but in their minds, they're hearing, we can keep society separate and we're not going to make it equal. We're not going to make society fair. And so we have Jim Crow laws. So Southern states are going to find any way they can to pass state and local laws that enforce racial segregation. So the South and parts of the North are going to be segregated, and Southern states in particular are going to do all they can to do something called disenfranchisement. The big word, it's on the word wall in my classroom. If you're disenfranchised, you are losing your rights. And in this case, we're talking mostly about the right to vote. So voting is one of the most important duties of an American citizen. It's how you affect change in your community. And so a lot of Southern communities don't want African Americans to vote, so they passed things like a poll tax and a literacy test. And most African Americans following the Civil War are very poor because they've spent hundreds of years in bondage and have never had time to build wealth, never have time to build property and a home and savings. And so they don't have much of anything. So a poll tax or a tax on voting keeps many people from being able to go to the ballot box to vote. And many newly freed slaves that are American citizens now never got an education while they were in slavery, so they don't know how to read or write. So a literacy test is another form of keeping people from voting, of course, who can't read, who are illiterate, so that you couldn't vote if you couldn't read. So there's all sorts of things that Southern states do to prevent African Americans from voting, and this won't be addressed. None of these problems are going to be addressed in American society until the 1950s and 60s. So what do some African Americans, not a lot, but some African Americans decide to leave the South because of segregation and Jim Crow laws and violence towards African Americans is very, very common in the South during this time period. So someone named Benjamin Pap Singleton, who was a former slave from Nashville, decides to organize a group called the Exodusters, and they decide to move west. So they're going to take part in what we were talking about at the beginning of the lesson with westward expansion. We're going to have African Americans moving out west to Kansas and Oklahoma. Now, this is following the Civil War. So this was one of the great, I wouldn't say a great migration. We are going to talk about some big migrations out of the South by African Americans, but this isn't a great migration. It's a smaller migration of African Americans out of the South as they go to the West to try to escape the prevalence of racism, and also they're trying to get the easily accessible land so that they can farm it and grow their own wealth. And so that's the end of the lesson. We have our timeline. So if you need to mentally put everything in chronological order, we have the Civil War starting in 1861. In 1862, during the Civil War, we have the Homestead Act. The war ends in 1865, and that's when Reconstruction starts. 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad is complete. 1877, we have the end of Reconstruction. 1887, we have the Dawes Act, and 1896, we have Plessy versus Ferguson. So that's kind of our timeline for this lesson. If you need to kind of see it all out and how it all played out in chronological order, this is the best way for us to do it, by looking at a timeline. Of course, all of our units, upcoming units, are all going to be on top of this timeline. So I always tell everybody, a lot of the class is just like a cake, and there's all these different layers, and it's all one cake, one time period. All these things are happening in American history. So we have a lot of changes. We have the end of slavery. We have African Americans becoming American citizens. We have Native Americans being forced onto reservations. We have Southern states becoming racially segregated, and the country is linked by railroads. Railroads are going to be the industrial driver of the United States for a very, very, very long time, and the railroads are so important to American history, even to this day. So that's the Nearpod. That's me explaining this first unit to you, and I hope this is very helpful as you start the activities.